down in Virginia in the United States. So our first speaker today will be Carl Knappett, who specializes in the Aegean Bronze Age, and Minoan Crete in particular. His main focus currently is the East Cretan site of, I don't know quite how to say this, Carl,
Palekastro.
Okay. He directs a new excavation project here at that location. Professor Knappett continues his research on pottery from a number of Aegean sites such as Knossos, Malea, Myrtos, Pergos, Kretiri, and Miletus. This multi-sited approach has led him into various kinds of network analysis for investigating regional interactions. Our second speaker today will be Irad Malkin, who recently published a book, soon in paperback. Has it come out yet? Or, okay, so it has come out, you should check it out. It applies network theory to the question of how Greek civilization emerged during the Archaic period when Greeks were actually distancing from each other. So he's particularly interested in the question of how civilizational convergences accompany settlement divergence. And finally, our third speaker will be John Kloppenborg, who is a specialist in Christian origins and Second Temple Judaism. He's particularly interested in the Jesus tradition, in both the canonical and non-canonical Gospels, and in the social world of the early Jesus movement in Jewish Palestine and the cities of the Eastern Empire. He's written extensively on the Synoptic Sayings Gospels and the Synoptic problem, and is currently writing on the parables of Jesus, the letters of James, and cultic, professional, and ethnic associations in the Greco-Roman world. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Carl, if that's okay. And
Sure.
Then we'll move to Irad, and then John.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Thanks to all of you for being here for this lightning lunch. What I want to do in, I hope a nutshell, is argue that a computational or digital approach has great utility for understanding the emergence and maybe collapse of ancient societies. Why do I say this? Because relations are key to dynamics. Relations are multiplex and heterogeneous. They thus need to be simplified for analytical purposes using abstractions of various kinds. And one of the best kinds of abstractions is the network. And the network, I would say, can best be activated when at least in part computational. My own particular interest is in the ancient societies of the later, I'm going to try and share a few images, later prehistoric, is that working?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me just do this. I'm eating into my seconds here. The ancient societies of the later prehistoric Mediterranean, which you see here, and in particular the East Mediterranean. And we largely need to access some of these cultures via material culture, not just individual objects, but whole assemblages, which can look like this. There are a couple of different assemblages from Bronze Age, the Bronze Age Aegean. The traditional approach has been to order these assemblages into typologies, which like this, which then allow for connections to be made among assemblages, among sites, and the piecing together of cultures over space and time. However, this view of material culture risks being very static. It creates a series of entities with rather opaque relations between them. Also opaque are the relations between this material world and the social entities imagined to lie behind them. These social beings are pulling the strings, and that's where all the action is, and they generate the material, which then just becomes a sort of reflection of society. Many have questioned this static setup and sought more dynamic relational conceptions. One option that I've been quite drawn to is offered by actor network theory, with its active foregrounding of human-thing relations in the constitution of society. So people like Bruno Latour, John Law, and others. But it's got network in the title, right? Actor network theory. But the network side is rather poetic rather than really analytical. It doesn't offer a toolkit for analyzing relations. When I was first engaging with ANT and finding it attractive and trying to make it work archaeologically, I didn't see this as a big problem because there were network tools available in neighboring disciplines, in social network analysis, and in the rapidly emerging sociophysics. It seemed to me quite possible to put ANT together with network science, even though the latter wasn't so concerned with heterogeneous networks of people and things. So through this artifactual route, by thinking about these kinds of things on the screen, I stumbled into networks. But it wasn't really these kinds of networks that I initially worked on. Because of a chance meeting with some theoretical physicists in an EU project, I ended up working on regional settlement networks and collaborating on new kinds of spatial interaction models. So looking at problems at this scale, you know, how do different sites across this region connect up? Why are some places like Knossos there at the bottom bigger than others and seemingly more connected? And so we did some network modeling to try and get at some of the dynamics that might be in play. This was a lot of fun and led me to read around network approaches in archaeology more generally, which were quickly growing in the mid-2000s. A lot of them were also aimed at the regional level, like ours, very much at the regional level, the Southern Aegean. Other very important applications, developments by Barbara Mills, for example, in the US Southwest, looking at this kind of regional level, although this was based not really on space as such, but on artifact similarities. Eventually, I started wondering if these techniques for the regional level could be scaled down to micro level so that the node, the dot, wasn't the site, but perhaps even a household or something like that, or even elements within a household. I didn't really make much headway in thinking at that micro scale level method-wise, but I kept on believing that a sort of network approach ought to be possible at that scale as well. At the same time, out of actor network theory, broadly, a range of theories had developed to get at human-thing relations, like entanglement theory, assemblage theory, and the idea of the meshwork, which are each helpful in imagining the imbrications of people and things and the impact of those on innovation and change. But in some ways, they don't differ from ANT in that they too fail to offer really any toolkit for analyzing relations. ANT had the excuse of emerging before the explosion of interest in networks. But now that excuse isn't really valid. So why not use network methods to think through human thing implications? Well, some of these approaches actually explicitly react to and reject networks. So why do that? You know, whether it's conscious or unconscious. I'd say it's this resistance to taking a kind of network route lies in some of the assumptions around science, because network is it's network science, right? The two are often paired together. There's a fear or worry about the use of models, about reductionism, abstraction generally, and perhaps also a sort of a quest for explanation rather than understanding. So for erklären rather than verstehen. I find this like standoff really fascinating, but also a hindrance to the uptake of network methods in the humanities as computational or digital initiatives. I'm especially struck by the lack of uptake in art history, the department in which I'm based at U of T, where there seems to me ample potential for network methods in computational humanities projects. In archaeology, so I'm an archaeologist in an art history department, so I'm seeing a little bit of both. In archaeology, there's a readier engagement with network methods. It's more social science after all, although that's a bit complicated because classical archaeology is usually in humanities departments, so it's not all that clear cut. But even in archaeology, despite its position more towards social science, there's a divergence between humanistic and scientific outlooks. And one can see that in the way that networks see different kinds of uptake. Fortunately, there are very positive developments that cross this line. So putting assemblage theory, more humanistic if you like, into close dialogue with network method. So there's work by Gisli Paulsen and also by Sarah Knudsen, for example, and here's an example of her very recent work that tries to put the two together. And there's also work on entanglement that seeks to bridge these sorts of divides. We can see in this kind of work both sensitivity to the heterogeneity of social worlds and a commitment to explicit models and methods with some computational aspect. I think this is really interesting for digital or computational humanities. Just to bring this back to the East Mediterranean and later prehistory, I'm working towards a kind of multi-scalar, multi-sided perspective to try and recognize the particularities of material cultural assemblages and blah, blah, blah. I basically haven't done it yet, but I'm very inspired by these other approaches. And that's what I'm sort of working towards for the material here, which requires an awful lot of work on the material culture to pull it off. Okay, that's probably a bit over 7 minutes, but hopefully not too much. Thank you.
You see it? All right, now this was my suggestion for the cover of my book, Small Greek World, where I apply network theory to the question of how did the Greeks have a civilization that we can typify as Greek. Oxford University Press thought the frogs were not serious enough, so we moved on to this one. Came out in French also last year, Small Greek World. Now, basically, this is the small Greek world, my small Greek world. Note that I'm a specialist in Greek colonization, and note that out of the 1,000 Greek city-states that had existed around 500 BCE, about 40%, I repeat, about 400 of them, almost 400 of them, were new colonies. And it was colonies and mother cities and colonies that in turn also became mother cities of other colonies that also became colonies. In short, it was a big sort of complex network of Greeks living around the shores of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Here's Duncan Watts, a physicist who influenced my work quite a lot. He says, one of the great mysteries of large distributed systems, from communities and organizations to the brain and ecosystems. Note that the claim is for universality of network theory. It doesn't just have to do with art, archaeology, or physics or society. From brain and ecosystem is how globally coherent activity can emit the quote from Duncan Watts, if it's okay, who says that one of the great mysteries of large distributed systems, from communities and organizations to the brain and ecosystems, is how globally coherent activity can emerge in the absence of centralized authority or control. It is this view of a network as an integral part of a continuously evolving and self-constituting, I emphasize self-constituting system, that is truly new about the science of networks. Now, in my book, I'll throw you a lot of concepts, but basically, I claim that the Greek wide web, that which emerges Greek civilization through the dynamics of networks, the Greek wide web was multi-directional, decentralized, non-hierarchical, boundless and proliferating, accessible, expansive, and interactive. The multidirectionality is an important aspect of those networks, including what I call the back ripple effect, namely like you throw a stone into a pond of water, the ripples go out and they converge back in. This is how the islands of Rhodos, for example, became a polity, from the Mediterranean backward to itself. This is very different from the Roman concept of mare nostrum, of a center radiating out to a periphery. The Greek world, by contrast, was a mishmash of mother cities and colonies with lots of other differences, such as sub-ethnic identities, dialects, and so on and so forth. So basically, if you take this is a drawing by Albert Laszlo Barabashi in his book Linked, on the diagram on the left, each node has connections only with its immediate neighbors. So if you want to pass a message from this one to this one, you have to go through all of these first, and usually the message doesn't get very clear. However, and this is the great development that was published in 1999 by Strogatz and Watts, it's enough to throw a few random elements, not aware that the entire thing becomes a system by an upward of links between 80 to 95%, not more than that. So, but that's quite significant. So in short, the self-organization of a complex system is the key word. So my point of departure, and I'll try to keep to those 7 minutes, my point of departure was a basic observation, namely Greek civilization came into being just when Greeks were basically splitting apart as far as possible from each other. It's a kind of an historical paradox. It's not a question of convergence and now finally we're together, we can create a civilization. No, it's created not in spite of distance, as old German scholarships used to be so proud of those Greeks who, in spite of their fragmentation, managed to have something cohere. No, on the contrary, it's because of the distance that we have Greek civilization the way it is. It's because they were dispersed. Now, what connected them? These are the dynamics I'm trying to understand in my book. So, in periods like the Archaic period, when the horizons suddenly open, when vast spaces shrink because of better communication and connectivity moves to a more efficient and richer level, identities, collective identities, seem to acquire new perspectives and undergo quick realignments. All those newly founded Greek colonies, looking at each other like those frogs across the water, were undergoing similar yet almost simultaneous experiences, yet at a great distance from each other. Links, both random links and planned ones, rapidly reduced the distance between the nodes of the network, turning the vast Mediterranean and the Black Sea into a small world, a defining term in network theory. The emergence of what I call commonalities was a process of convergence through divergence. What is noteworthy is that the more Greeks dispersed, somehow the more Greek they became. And of course, religion, and I was asked to direct some of my talk to that, religion played a key role. On a pan-Hellenic level, for example, the Delphic oracle and its role in colonization and foundation oracles, and Apollo Archegetes, the god of colonization, became the virtual center of the Greek world, in fact. Actually, some Greeks thought that was the actual center of the world, the omphalos. Now, on the polis level, on the other hand, we have the pan-Hellenic dimension, mixture through lotteries. Lotteries is my current research. Mixture of people, mixture of societies, mixture through lotteries serve the purpose of social and cultural homogenization. Because you should know that a Greek colony was founded by a mother city, as the textbook tells, but actually a small nucleus from a mother city would come with an oikistes, and many other migrants. This is evidence, already explicit evidence from the 7th century, from Archilochus. Many others would join and would sort of The melting pot would be the set of nomima, the religious nomima. Nomima included the terminology of the tribes, the number of the tribes, the terms of their magistracies, and most important, the religious calendar, because the gods were also colonists. The gods received tracts of land, temenea, together with the kleroi, the colonists would get. So the mixture would be through the funnel of the nomima on the one hand, but also with comprehensive lotteries that distributed equal, I emphasize equal plots of land. A kleros is a plot of land. Kleros also means the piece with which you do the lottery itself, but it also means the section of land that you get, either through inheritance or through purchase or through this kind of colonial lottery. So you got a whole set of mixture, and the explicit values associated with that are isai kai homoiai, equal and fair, or equal and like, if you wish, terms. So the notion of egalitarianism through those networks is very powerful already in the early archaic period, as you see in the colony Megara Hibla in Sicily in particular. Finally, on the regional level, we spoke about the Panhellenic, then the polis, now let's go to the middle. On the regional level, take Sicily. I have a whole chapter on that. Sicily is where every time a sacred embassy would sail away from Sicily, they would first stop at Naxos. Naxos was a sort of the Plymouth Rock of Greek colonization. This is the first point where Greeks had landed in Sicily, and they would set out from that very point. Now, who would set out? That's the interesting thing, the Sikeliotai. Sikeliotai are Sicilian Greeks defined regionally. Remember, there were Dorians and Ionians, Chalkidians, and others. They usually didn't like each other very much. But on that sacred ship that sailed away from Naxos were all of them together. It's a kind of a mixture network through the connection to the Omphalos at Delphi and to the Greek world at large. So you see polis networks, Panhellenic networks, and regional networks working in a dynamic that more or less bring people together, sometimes consciously, like the Theoria network, sometimes just by way of interaction, because on the same ships, remember, there were no passenger ships in antiquity. On the same ship would travel a wine merchant, or just imagine, I'll finish with that, the ship that sailed away to Thurii, or on its board, I imagine Herodotus, Lysias, Protagoras, and Hippodamus of Miletus. All of them were settlers or reputed to have been settlers at Thurii. Now, the ship itself is basically a link that carries wine, say, or oil, or whatever. But on board the ship, you got Greeks from Halikarnassus, from Miletus, from Athens, from all over the place, converging and contributing to commonalities of Greek civilization. I think I've reached my 7 minutes. Thank you.
This is crazy. All right, so I'm not anywhere near as far along on my project as I hear you are, Irad, or Carl. But the focus of my research is on the diffusion of elective cults in Mediterranean during the late Hellenistic and early Roman periods. And what I mean by elective cults is to distinguish, say, the cults of Isis or Serapis, Mithras, Jupiter, Dolichenos, and Christ, and so forth, from polis religion, from civic cults. The project has at least 3 dimensions, as I understand it. First is the construction of social networks through which elective cults diffused. Secondly, the search for wide bridges between individual networks that allow for cultic knowledge and especially cultic practices to move from one network domain to another. And third, an understanding of what I call cultic ecologies, those features that elective cults required in order to thrive and propagate. That also includes thinking about ecological failures, why some didn't manage to thrive. So on the first point, my working assumption is that ancient cults and knowledge about ancient cults moved through social networks. That's not all that a difficult of an assumption. And in many cases, probably on the backs of commercial, military, and perhaps family networks. Although there there may have been some itinerant religious specialists whose movements were unrelated to, say, commercial movement. What's, I think, often imagined for the Apostle Paul or Peregrinus Proteus. I think it likely that most cults moved with other networks or within other networks, military or commercial. One of the models that is often invoked for the diffusion of elective cults is an epidemiological model in which elective cults, on the analogy of infections, diffuse in social networks to their most proximate neighbors. Indeed, that's what Pliny thinks in the early 2nd century, where he compared the spread of the Christ cult to a contagion, superstitionis istius contagio. Tim Hegedus, in an article in 1998, used this model to track the cult of Isis, arguing that distance from Alexandria was seemingly a factor in the spread of that cult. Of the 12 cities that show evidence of the cult of Isis by the beginning of the 1st century, 11 of them were less than 1,600 kilometers from Alexandria, and the exception was Rome, which already had strong commercial relationships with Alexandria. More recently, Anna Koller has explicitly used proximal point analysis to model the diffusion of cults, the cults of Theos Hypsistos, diasporic Judaism, and I think more successfully, the cult of Jupiter Dolichenos, which diffused along the Rhine-Danube frontier, mainly in connection with legionary camps. Geographical proximity appears to have some salience for modeling the diffusion of some cults, but there are some anomalies. So in the case of the diffusion of Mithraism, it at least makes more complicated PPA. Mithraism appears to have been founded by Commagenian military units in the 1st century. This is at least Roger Beck's theory, which I think is cogent. But interestingly, it appears in the late 1st century and early 2nd almost simultaneously in Germania Superior, Noricum, Pannonia Superior, Mysia Inferior, but also in Rome, Judea, and Phrygia, which are not geographically connected to the main sites of diffusion. What makes sense, I think, of this rather odd pattern of distribution is the fact that in the late 60s, Commagenian units were engaged as auxilia, both in the Judean War in 69-70 and in the Civil War in 69 in Rome. Beck has argued, in fact, that the mysteries of Mithras were founded wherever subsets of the highly mobile Commagenian founding group interacted with their military and civilian peers. It would seem that a network map of cultic diffusion cannot simply rely strictly on the geographical model of diffusion, but must be able to factor in the mobility of the agents of diffusion. In this case, units, Commagenian units of the Roman armies. So this is still very much a work in progress, but I'm trying to reconcile the efficiency of the proximal point analysis model of diffusion with some of these anomalous data. The second aspect of the project begins with the thesis of Damon Centola, who's distinguished between simple and complex contagions. Simple contagions for him include infections, rumors, and information, and perhaps some forms of technological innovation, I suppose, which require little or no agency on the part of the recipients and no persuasion. With simple contagions, weak links are instrumental in diffusion, as Granovetter has, I think, shown. Complex contagions, on the other hand, include the adoption of new technologies, new practices, new cultic behaviors, and because adoption may pose certain risks and impose costs, social, economic, reputational, on those who adopt those practices, it turns out that weak links are insufficient to account for diffusion across a network. In fact, in Centola's modeling, he has shown that in some cases, weak links actually stopped diffusion entirely. For example, in a community of anti-vaxxers, a single nudge from a weak link, say a relative or a physician even, is unlikely to be compelling in changing behavior. What diffusion of a complex contagion requires is not weak links, but wide bridges between networks where the nudges are delivered by multiple network contacts, or perhaps a contact that has sufficient social weight to persuade subjects that a new behavior or an innovation possesses enough credibility and efficacy to warrant adoption. Beck, for example, says of the spread of Mithraism that the founding group has to have one social insider, probably not the elite, but it cannot have comprised marginal or alienated persons. Otherwise, Mithraism's speedy adoption by moderately successful and trusted persons with no apparent suspicion on the part of their patrons or superiors would be inexplicable. Moreover, the group must have been such as to commend itself simultaneously to persons of this sort, both in military and in household contexts, since Mithraism in its earliest phases is firmly located in both circles, both military and household circles. At least in the case of the diffusion of the cult of Jupiter Dolophenos, the cult seems to have spread via centurions, who were both mobile, being shifted from one legion to another, and influential both to those under their command and often to civilians in towns near legionary camps. The wide bridges in the diffusion of elective cults are critical for a number of reasons that Centola outlines in his latest book on behavioral change. Diffusion of innovations is not just a matter of offering a better solution to an old problem, that is, building a better mousetrap, as it were. Barriers to adoption of complex contagions include the problem of coordination, credibility, and legitimacy. And coordination is especially important in the diffusion of cultic practices, since one does not practice a cult by oneself any more than you adopt email or Twitter by oneself. This suggests that cultic behaviors spread via multiple agents, say groups of centurions rather than individuals. The credibility of a new behavior, does it work, is enhanced the more social confirmation there is, and the legitimacy of a new behavior concerns the degree of risk or reputational damage that's entailed in the adoption. The greater the number of persons in one's network who have adopted a new cultic practice, say the cult of Christ or the cult of Isis or whatever, and especially if persons of higher rank have adopted those behaviors, the less risk and danger of reputational damage there is. This is Centola's view, and I think that makes some sense. This suggests to me that the construction of the networks responsible for the diffusion of cultic innovations, for those, we must look for wide bridges and or actors whose social influence was sufficient to enhance credibility and legitimacy. An obvious example would be the effect that the adoption of the Christ cult by Constantine had on various sectors of Roman society. And we'd at least have to also think about why it didn't have an effect on those of senatorial rank until very much later. The third aspect of the project looks not at individuals and why they might embrace a new behavior, but the requirements of the cult itself. Elective cults had their own, what I call distinctive cultic ecologies, and this is a concept that I've borrowed from epidemiology, where each pathogen has its own set of ecological conditions that allows it to thrive and to propagate. So, I mean, this is kind of obvious. Malaria requires strains of the Anopheles mosquito with sufficient tolerance to Plasmodium to allow the pathogen to infect the mosquito's gut and thence spread the infection to other hosts. Since the measles virus, for example, is destroyed by ultraviolet radiation from the sun and doesn't survive very well in the air or in the cold, measles needs temperate climates and moist surfaces in order to propagate properly. So cults, as I see them, also had their ecological requirements. In the case of Mithraism, it depended on access to artificial caves, and these in turn required resources on the part of the adherents to construct or modify such buildings. Vaulted horea were ideal. The Mithraeum in Caesarea Maritima is a converted storeroom. But in some cases, Mithraea seem to have been constructed ex nihilo. All this requires financial and other resources. As I've suggested elsewhere, the cult of Christ became a book culture very quickly, which meant that it needed readers. Not that all or even most Christians were literate, they probably weren't, but at least some had to be able to read. And thus there was a kind of logic in both the Decian and Diocletianic persecutions of confiscating scriptures. Other cults needed ritual specialists, especially the cults of the diasporic cult of Isis, which typically imported Egyptian priests in order to conduct their mysteries. So each of these ecological requirements had to be met via supplying networks, individuals willing to foot the costs of special architectural forms and the availability of literate persons and access to book production, or the availability of ritual specialists, or simply enough devotees to replace deaths and defections and to supply the financial resources to keep a cult going. So that's a kind of sketch of the project that I'm embarking on with these three components to it. I've been working simultaneously on all three aspects: reconstructing transmitting networks, thinking how to conceptualize the barriers to adoption of a variety of cults, and how some of these cults overcame those barriers, and also working out what I've called cultic ecology for several of these cults. So that's where I'll end, and I hope that I was actually heard. Or am I talking to myself?
No, you're not talking to yourself.
Oh, okay.
Not at all.
All right.
No, thank you so much for these fascinating presentations to Carl, Irad, and John, and thank you so much to our participants. And I have to say proudly that we have not lost anyone through all of these technological difficulties. So I might take, moderator's prerogative here to ask the first question as people, finish up jotting down notes or formulate their ideas. When we talk about network analysis in the contemporary period, it's very much applied to digital networks, right? So to social media, Facebook, Twitter. So I was wondering, this is open to any of the speakers, if you could tell us more about how kind of the genealogy, the history of network analysis being applied to the ancient world. Like, how did that become a methodology?
Well, let me start with the reverse spectrum, chronological spectrum. Social network analysis, as Andrew Coben has shown in his book on the use of drones by the American Army under President Obama, is really responsible for quite a large number of deaths and hellfire missiles rained upon people, with identified purely through social network analysis and their phone contacts, including entire weddings were blown up because of this. So there's a danger of adopting theories and trying to apply them so directly, and sometimes with horrible effects. As far as when did we start looking at the ancient world in terms of networks? I often wonder how ideas come into our heads. We may think they're original, and they may be for us, but sometimes has to do with the zeitgeist where we're at. It happened when I started writing about ethnicity, and then I found I wasn't alone, and then I started writing about networks. And soon after, I was happy to see I wasn't alone. The trouble is that sometimes, like the work of Giovanni Ruffini, for example, an excellent historian, they think that SNA is the only name of the game, and therefore, if you do something else, it's no longer network theory, which is simply ignorance of what's happening in physics and such. But it's true that somebody did a social network analysis of physicists and sociologists and noticed that they all are talking to themselves and not to each other. So those wide bridges that you mentioned are also needed among scholars, not just when we apply them to antiquity. But in short, it's pretty new, the application of network theory to antiquity. Isn't that right, Carl? What do you think?
Yeah, I'd say there's been a boom in the last really only 15 years, I guess, not even 20 really. And yeah, there's definitely a zeitgeist aspect to that, I think. I guess one thing just to note is that Facebook and what have you as social networks. I mean, you can understand them without any geometric or physical routing to them, as just kind of social clouds. And of course, people are in physical locations, but that somehow can be secondary. And a lot of social network analysis, friendship networks and the like, are focused on those sort of the topology, if you like. Whereas in archaeology, we can't. It's somehow hard to get away from the physical space. So even if networks can be understood relationally, we tend to plot them on a map. So that's an interesting kind of aspect to it.
I would say that the beginning is a little bit earlier. There was a number of social scientists like Jeremy Bossevin, Stefan Schmidt, who worked on social networks. They didn't often call them that, but friends of friends, patronage networks, and so forth in classics. Now they did not have the tools, the electronic tools, to do the kind of analysis that's done right now. But the idea of connectivity between persons was already there, and when the electronic tools come along and the modeling tools, then it really takes off.
I have to say, the social network analysis is really prosopography with computers. I mean, we have prosopography since 1939 in Roman sign, the Roman Revolution, and Matthias Gelzer. They were doing social network analysis without calling it that and without computers. It's precisely was the idea to find out who's pulling the string behind the scenes, if we can notice who's going to whose party. And so that kind of a social network analysis has been around for at least 80 years. The new aspect of it is really the ability to use computers. But can I use the opportunity also to take it up with Carl, the difference in actor network theory, which is relevant to the question we're asking now. Okay, there are relations between things, but there are also semiotic relations between concepts. And these four elements in active network theory sort of work together. As an archaeologist, can you access the semiotic side easily, or how do you do that?
Yeah, maybe not so much in prehistory. I mean, we have our types, I suppose, which we, I guess, are assuming have some communicative emic status, although that's difficult to be too sure about. I haven't thought about the semiotic part of actor network theory enough, I guess. I wonder if I could sort of change the subject a little bit, and I'm really excited by a possible kind of connection here, which may be just me conflating different levels of analysis or something. But Irad, when you were talking about all the passengers on the boat kind of thing, and the sort of heterogeneity, and the possibility for lots of different kinds of actors to be sort of on board, so to speak. And then I wondered what kind of ontology or worldview or whatever would enable that, and what sort of understanding of relationships would let that happen. And I guess one could say it's a shared this or a shared that. It's a common religion or something. But then I suppose I was thinking maybe a bit too materially. But when John was talking about wide bridges, I was sort of imagining this heterogeneous bunch shoulder to shoulder, and the need for a kind of wide bridge to allow them all to sort of pass. And I mean, can one try and put those two aspects together somehow, that you need a wide bridge, you need this kind of a certain kind of link to...
You do have that. You do have that huge link. Somehow, luckily, was it an accident of history? I don't know. But the first part of the first millennium BCE, the Mediterranean was a vacuum in terms of central powers. Until Rome, you don't have anybody controlling the Mediterranean, really, and you have sections of the Athenian Empire, 80 years here and that, and there, Hellenistic, but mostly in the archaic and early classical Mediterranean, you don't have that. The sea is wide open. And you see this with the pattern of settlements of Greeks. They never go into the hinterland, never, I exaggerate, but hardly ever. Usually offshore islands, promontories, river mouths in the worst case scenario. And think of Marseille in southern France. For 600 years, 6 centuries, the entire depth of the Greek chora along the entire southern shore of France was between 5 and 15 kilometers, not more. This is not Roman Gaul, right? We've got huge. So the open spaces of the sea, the connectivity that the sea allows, and the notion of everything is open came together with the other idea that once you arrive at a place, you treat it as eremos chora, empty land. Think of how Thucydides describes the colonization of Syracuse. First, they kicked out the inhabitants from the little islets of Ortygia, and then they arranged it nicely in square blocks with equal plots of land for everyone else, distributed by lottery, which meant almost a priori that no natives were allowed, in spite of some wishful thinking, mostly by archaeologists' friends in southern Italy. On the whole, you don't find that. It's a kind of a Weltanschauung, as you say, worldview, that sees the sea as open spaces. There are no paths in the sea, as Purcell and Horden have very nicely shown. No routes you can block. And so everything is really wide open. I once wrote an analysis of the spatial dimensions and anabasis of Xenophon, the difference between land perceptions and sea perceptions, the visual continuum that you get when you sail with the ship to a new land. Think of the Bay of Lion between France and Spain. For us, it's a really fragmented land with Pyrenees and everything in the middle, but sailing from the sea is a single line, dotted by promontories with temples to Artemis of Ephesus. So the sea, in one word, is the answer.
So if I could jump in here, we've got a couple of questions in chat that really deal with like the mechanics of your research and how you conducted it. So Kelly Schultz was asking how, like what tools do you use? What tools or resources do you use to conduct your network analysis, or what software?
The question is addressed to who?
This was Kelly Schultz.
But to whom is it addressed?
Oh, I'm sorry, to any of you.
I can say something about the work I've done on spatial interaction models. It involved devising a new program, basically, with the physicists put something together in Java. I mean, this is quite a long time ago now, and it was kind of bespoke, if you like. It was put together for our own purposes, although it has been made available on the Imperial website, where my colleagues work with limited success. It's a bit tricky to operate, but with some funding, it could probably be made to work. But that's for spatial interaction modeling with gravity and various other sorts of tricks. Other people use, I mean, the common ones are Gephi, Cytoscape. I mean, it just depends. There is a bit of a problem reconciling kind of spatial analysis with like social network analysis.
Mm-hmm.
Both seems a bit tricky. Tom Brugmans is someone who's trying to figure that out.
Okay.
I didn't use any.
You didn't use any. So did you
None
do all
whatsoever.
of the
The trouble is that since I'm dealing in a very wide spaces over quite a few centuries with the kind of fragmented data that we have, I wish I could have done something like Giovanni Ruffini, where he had 2 villages in Byzantine Egypt with 2 closed archives, actually really closed in sacks, and he could, do computer analysis of both of them. My kind of data is so diversified and so wide-ranging, so I have to work on what historians always work on the 3 levels of the certain, the probable, and the possible. And I'm trying to push things to likely, from likely to highly likely,
Mm-hmm.
highly probable and such. We cannot never really prove with computers unless I limit the set of questions very specifically, say, to classes of material data and such, and there it is important to do so. Otherwise not. And the other thing is I tried several times to find ways to draw what I'm doing, to present graphs and maps. The trouble is they become so one-dimensional and they don't really show the dynamics, because you see for an historian and for an archaeologist, it's much easier to observe what happens at port A, say Caesarea Maritima, and what happens at port B. What's happening in the middle is what matters, and it's very difficult for us to grasp because this was moving in ships all the time. Luckily, sometimes you can find, say, a shipwreck, a Phoenician shipwreck that carries Euboean merchandise. Aha, there you see a kind of a va-et-vient à la Méditerranée, which is far more mixed and such, but these are occasional finds. So if you want to ask a big civilizational historical question, it's very difficult to put that into number crunching in computers. I wish I could, and I wish I had been done, say, in the French Revolution, historical studies and such, where they have much more data, and of course they can do that. But I found it was more misleading to the type of questions I was asking. It's not I don't have a priori anything against it, of course, on the contrary. So no, I didn't.
The data challenge for the Mediterranean scale would just be mind-boggling. I mean, it's just yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a
For
yeah.
I was going to say for me, the because I come to this whole topic having worked for a long time on Greek and Roman associations, that is occupational guilds and cultic associations, neighborhood clubs, and so forth. The data that I start with is membership lists, where from sites like Athens, especially Roman Ostia and Delos, we've got enough data of membership lists and names and so forth that it's possible to sort out some of the interconnections between, for example, occupational guilds and cultic associations in Ostia. You can see some people belong to both, and you can start to, create some kind of paths between various kinds of social organizations. And it's my assumption that at least some cultic knowledge moves through those, what I call network intersections. I wish I had more data, but I think for most of us who work in the Mediterranean, we don't have very much to work with. As far as the tools that I use, electronic tools, I've been using Gephi, which is okay, but Gephi doesn't allow me to visualize multiplex relationships very easily, which I want to be able to do, because in some associations, I've got both family connections and connections that are made on the basis of a common occupation, and then other kinds of connections. And there's, in some cases, the connection between two guilds, let's say, is spatial. They actually occupy contiguous spaces within a place like Ostia or Delos. So having the instruments that allow me to model various kinds of connectivity, whether it's familial connections or marital connections or spatial connections or occupational connections, Gephi is kind of one-dimensional in that sense, and that's I'm wondering whether Cytoscape or a program like that is going to allow me to show different kinds of connectivity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so follow-up question to that, and John already started kind of answering it. Kathy Chung asks, what kind of data do all of the speakers use to study your networks? And so she's particularly interested, is it family relations, social rank, salaries? And further to that, how much data allows you to, you know, as Irad said, move from likely to highly likely to make these kind of conclusions from your analysis?
I guess I'm promiscuous. I use whatever data I can get, because the problem is it's not, you know, you don't get a consistent profile from each site, and you don't get a consistent profile from one temporal period to another. You get little snapshots of this kind of data or that kind of data. I should say that also, in some cases, I think we have to reverse engineer networks. That is, when I think this must be the case in pottery analysis too. When I dug in at the top of the Kinneret, we found pottery from Puglia there, and also Rhodian amphora. So it's not that we've got any literary data that tells us that there's a connection between Bethsaida in Israel and Puglia, but somehow or other Puglian pottery got there, or Rhodian amphora. Or in the case of literary texts, one of the things that interests me is how literary text moved throughout the Mediterranean. You know, Irenaeus in about the 180s writes an anti-heretical tractate, Adversus Haereses, and within 20 years, there's a copy of it in Oxyrhynchus. Now, I assume that it got there probably via the grain trade, because there's constant shipping going from, both from the Rhone Valley down to Ostia, and Ostia to various Mediterranean sites. And I suppose that the literary document moves via a Christian who happens to be on one of those boats. So, I mean, I think of that as reverse engineering the network. You know that it has to have existed because you've got the end products. And then you try to figure out the simplest way for it to get from Lyon to Oxyrhynchus.
Yeah, I would just follow up on that and say that there's one archaeologist, Soren Sinbach, who has said we don't when we're faced with material culture in the past, we're not really doing social network analysis. We're doing a kind of synthesis, and there's a black box problem. We sort of have some inputs and some outputs, but we're not really seeing the social networks that are creating those outputs. So something that some archaeologists do to quite good effect is to employ similarity measures, so that you may have, for example, an obsidian source, and or you have a couple of obsidian sources, and you have a bunch of consumer sites that are using this resource, and you know, if a bunch of sites are all making a lot of use of one source rather than the other, then one then uses that as a proxy for their interconnectivity, that they're all sharing use of this resource, so they must be connected in some way. You don't actually see any social link, but you assume that they're all they have a togetherness or a shared link in some way because of that. Or there might be 20 different kinds of pot that one could conceivably consume in an area, and if 30 sites are all sharing a lot of those wares, and there's another 30 sites that aren't so much, you say, well, these ones are socially connected in a way that these ones are not. I mean, there's some assumptions there, but
yeah,
it's what is often done to great effect in the US Southwest by a team with a very, very big data set, and they're able to make that work.
It depends a lot also on the question you ask and the kind of palimpsest of data that one is ready to place one on top of the other and see what happens when they overlap. For example, Western Sicily, okay? Western Sicily was mostly Phoenician in the early archaic period, with lots of Phoenician influence, with the cult of Melkart, the Phoenician god, Melech Keret, the king of the city, literally. Melkart, very prominent there, as were most Tyrian colonies. By the way, there's no other mother city except Tyre in the Mediterranean, so Phoenician colonization is always a misnomer. But and then you have sets of myths that connect Heracles with Western Sicily. So far so good. Then you start putting things together. You look at the archaeology of Phoenician settlement. You look at the Phoenician coin called Rosh Melkart, the headland actually of Melkart, that very same god. And you look at the fact that since the 7th century, Melkart and Heracles are identified already in Cyprus, in the Phoenician city, with a Greek sort of paraphernalia with the lion skin and the club, but it's clearly Melkart. And so you start asking questions, connecting it with historical events, and you see that Dorieus, the Spartan, claimed Western Sicily as his personal legacy, his promised land as a direct descendant of Heracles. So what's he doing there? So for 2 centuries, the myth of Melkart was actually an accommodating myth for other Greeks living in Sicily together with the Phoenicians. And suddenly the very same myth, I'm reminded of my own country, where the children of Abraham can be terrible enemies or lovely cousins, depending on the historical period. The old children of Abraham somehow. So you have the myth can serve either for belligerent causes or for accommodation, depending on the period. So only if you put those things together, you look at the dynamics, you look at the settlement of what later became Heraclea Minoa in Western Sicily. You look what happens to the local Phoenician names, and you notice the overlap, and you can come up with a historical thesis of network interaction. But only if you take, and again, the picture is not complete, and then the conclusion is always highly probable at best. But isn't life kind of answering such questions of highly probable? You can never really be certain.
Yeah, so do the speakers have any questions for each other, or are there any other questions from the audience?
I'd like to comment to John just that, in fact, sometimes people doing work in different countries or in different disciplines, the Max Planck Institute in Berlin, headed by the philosopher Jürgen Renn, is very much interested in the, do you know him? In the dissemination,
no, I don't.
In the dissemination of knowledge. One of his edited books is Globalization of Knowledge in the Post-Antique Mediterranean, but I spent a month there once, and I was astonished to see people, they're using different terms sometimes, so we don't find them in the same search engines. But sometimes the questions are quite similar, and if you have good contacts with them, they're very generous, actually. Why not spend a month at the Max Planck and write about the Roman army as a vehicle of transmission of religion? I think it's very good.
That's helpful. I have good contacts with Berlin, at least at the Humboldt, and so I can probably connect with them.
It's not the same.
Yeah, I know.
You know how it is with universities and institutions.
Yes.
Well, then perhaps if there's no other questions, this is a natural break in the conversation. Thank you again so much to our speakers. Thank you to everyone who came out today. It was wonderful that you were here. We will be putting together a recording of this event, and it will be available on both the Digital Humanities Network website and our YouTube channel. So I'm dropping the link into chat here. You'll be able to what the Digital Humanities Network is all about, and then also it will take you to the YouTube channel to view the recording later. So again, thank you everyone so much for coming out. Do take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you very
everyone.
much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.